friends! It's Miss Picado. I'm here for some story time, and we are going to continue with Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And remember, if you have not sent me a picture of this story, feel free, or if you're not inspired by this one, send me one from something else that you're reading. I would love to see those artworks inspired by books. All right, this is Chapter 4, Cherie. Cherie had long eyelashes. She weighed only 49 pounds. She always wore a big red and blue overcoat with a hood. The overcoat weighed 35 pounds. The red part weighed 15 pounds, the blue part weighed 15 pounds, and the hood weighed 5 pounds. Her eyelashes weighed 1.5 pounds. She sat next to the window in Mrs. Jewell's class. She spent a lot of time just staring out the window. Mrs. Jewell didn't mind. Mrs. Jewell said that a lot of people learn best when they stare out a window. Cherie often fell asleep in class. Mrs. Jewell didn't mind that either. She said that a lot of people do their best learning when they are asleep. Cherie spent all of her time either looking out the window or sleeping. Mrs. Jewell thought she was the best student in the class. One afternoon, it was very hot. All of the windows were open, yet Cherie still wore her red and blue overcoat. The heat made her very tired. Mrs. Jewell was teaching arithmetic, or math. Cherie pulled the hood up over her face, buried herself in the coat, and went to sleep. "Mrs. Jewell," said Kathy, "Cherie is asleep." "That's good," said Mrs. Jewell. "She must be learning something." Mrs. Jewell continued the lesson. Cherie, shoo, shoo, began to snore. "Mrs. Jewell, Cherie is snoring," said Kathy. "Yes, I can hear her," said Mrs. Jewell. "She must be learning an awful lot today. I wish the rest of you could be like her." Cherie began to toss and turn. She flopped over onto her desk and then rolled over on top of Kathy's desk. Then she rolled back the other way. Kathy screamed. Cherie rolled out the window. She was still sound asleep. As you know, Mrs. Jewell's class is on the 30th story of Wayside School. So, Cherie had a long way to go. After she had fallen 10 stories, Cherie woke up. She looked around. She was confused. She wasn't in Mrs. Jewell's class, and she wasn't at home in bed. She couldn't figure out where she was. Yawned, pulled the hood back over her eyes, and went back to sleep. By that time, she had fallen another 10 stories. Wayside School had an exceptionally large playground. Louis, the yard teacher, was way over on the other side of it when he happened to see Cherie fall out of the window. He ducked under the volleyball net, hurtled past the kickball field, hopped over the hopscotch court, climbed through the monkey bars, sped across the grass, and caught Cherie just before she hit the ground. The people in Mrs. Jewell's class cheered. Cherie woke up in Louis's arms. "Darn it, Louis," she said. "Why'd you have to go and wake me up for?" "I'm sorry, Cherie," said Louis. I'm sorry, Cherie repeated. "Is that all you can say? I was having a wonderful dream until you woke me up. You're always bothering me, Louis. I can't stand it." She laughed and hugged him around the neck. Louis carried her back up 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jewell's room. That evening, when Cherie went to bed, she wasn't able to fall asleep. She just wasn't tired. All right, this is Chapter 5, and it is about Todd. All of the children in Mrs. Jewell's class, except Todd, were talking and carrying on. Todd was thinking. Todd always thought before he spoke. When he got an idea, his eyes lit up. Todd finished thinking and began to speak. But before he said 2 words, Mrs. Jewell called him. "Todd," she said, "you know better than to talk in class. You must learn to work quietly like the other children." She wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd looked around in amazement. All of the other children who had been talking and screaming and fighting only seconds earlier were quietly working in their workbooks. Todd scratched his head. A child was given 3 chances in Miss Jewell's class. The first time he did something wrong, Miss Jewell wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. The second time he did something wrong, she put a check next to his name. And the third time he did something wrong, she circled his name. Todd reached into his desk and pulled out his workbook. He had only just started on it when he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. It was Joy. "What page are you on?" Joy asked. "Page 4, whispered Todd. "I'm on page 11, said Joy. Todd didn't say anything. He didn't want to get into trouble. He just went back to work. 5 minutes later, Joy tapped him again. Todd ignored her, so Joy poked him in the back with her pencil. Todd pretended he didn't notice. Joy got up from her seat and sharpened her pencil. She came back and poked it in Todd's back. "What page are you on?" she asked. "Page 5, Todd whispered. "Boy, are you dumb," said Joy. "I'm on page 29. "It isn't a race," Todd whispered. 5 minutes later, Joy pulled Todd's hair and didn't let go until he turned around. "What page are you on?" she demanded. "Page 6, Todd answered as quietly as he could. "I'm on page 200, Joy shouted. Todd was very angry. "Will you please let me do my work and stop bothering me?" Mrs. Jules heard him. "Todd, what did I say about talking in class?" Todd scratched his head. Mrs. Jules put a check next to Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd really tried to be good. He knew that if he talked one more time, Mrs. Jules would circle his name. Then he'd have to go home early at 12 o'clock on the kindergarten bus, just as he had the day before and the day before that. In fact, there hadn't been a single day since Mrs. Jules took over the class that she didn't send Todd home early. She said she did it for his own good. The other children went home at 2 o'clock. Todd wasn't really bad. He just always got caught. He really wanted to stay past 12 o'clock. He wanted to find out what the class did from 12 to 2. But it didn't look as though this was going to be his day. It was only 10:30, and he already had 2 strikes against him. He sealed his lips and went back to work. There was a knock on the door. Mrs. Jules opened it. 2 men stepped in wearing black masks. "Give us all your money," they demanded. "All I have is a nickel," said Mrs. Jules. "I have a dime," said Mauricia. "I have 13 cents, said Leslie. "I have 4 cents, said Damien. "What kind of bank is this?" asked one of the robbers. "It's not a bank, it's a school," said Todd. "Can't you read?" "No," said the robbers. "Neither can I," said Todd. "Do you mean we walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing?" asked the robber. "Don't you have anything valuable?" Todd's eyes lit up. "We sure do," he said. "We have knowledge." He grabbed Joy's workbook and gave it to the robbers. "Knowledge is much more valuable than money." "Thanks, kid," said one of the robbers. "Maybe I'll give up being a criminal and become a scientist," said the other. They left the room without hurting anybody. "Now I don't have a workbook," complained Joy. Mrs. Jules gave her a new one. Joy had to start all the way back at the beginning. "Hey, Joy, what page are you on?" asked Todd. "Page 1, Joy sighed. "I'm on page 8, laughed Todd triumphantly. Mrs. Jules heard him. She circled his name. Todd had 3 strikes against him. At 12 o'clock, he left the room to go home early on the kindergarten bus. But this time when he left, he was like a star baseball player leaving the field. All of the children stood up, clapped their hands, and whistled. Todd scratched his head. Why were they whistling? You guys know? It's because he saved them from the robber, which you would think Mrs. Jules would have given him another chance, but not for Todd. He still went home on the kindergarten bus. Chapter 6 is called BB. BB was a girl with short brown hair, a little BB nose, and totally tiny toes, and big brown eyes. Her full name was BB Gunn. She was the fastest draw in Mrs. Jules' class. She could draw a cat in less than 45 seconds, a dog in less than 30, and a flower in less than 8 seconds. But of course, BB never drew just one dog, or one cat, or one flower. Art was from 12:30 to 1:30. Why, in that time, she could draw 50 cats, 100 flowers, 20 dogs, and several eggs or watermelons. It took her the same amount of time to draw a watermelon as it did to draw an egg. Calvin sat next to BB. He didn't think he was very good at art. Why, it took him the whole period just to draw one airplane. So instead, he just helped BB. He was BB's assistant. As soon as Bibi would finish one masterpiece, Calvin would take it from her and set down a clean sheet of paper. Whenever her crayon ran low, Calvin was ready with a new crayon. That way, Bibi didn't have to waste any time. And in return, Bibi would draw 5 or 6 airplanes for Calvin. It was 12:30, time for art. Bibi was ready. On her desk was a sheet of yellow construction paper. In her hand was a green crayon. Calvin was ready. He had a stack of paper and a box of crayons. Ready, Bibi? Said Calvin. Ready, Calvin, said Bibi. Okay, said Mrs. Jules. Time for art. She had hardly finished her sentence when Bibi had already drawn a picture of a leaf. Calvin took it from her and put another piece of paper down. Red, called Bibi. Calvin handed Bibi a red crayon. Blue, called Bibi. He gave her a blue crayon. They were quite a pair. Their teamwork was remarkable. Bibi drew pictures as fast as Calvin could pick up the old paper and set down the new. A fish, an apple, 3 cherries, bing, bing, bing. At 1:30, Mrs. Jules announced, Okay, class, art is over. Bibi dropped her crayon and fell over on her desk. Calvin sighed and leaned back in his chair. He could hardly move. They had broken their old record. Bibi had drawn 378 pictures. They lay in a pile on Calvin's desk. Mrs. Calvin walked by. Calvin, did you draw all these pictures? Calvin laughed. No, I can't draw. Bibi drew them all. Well then, what did you draw? Said Mrs. Jules. I didn't draw anything, said Calvin. Why not? Don't you like art? Asked Mrs. Jules. I love art, said Calvin. That's why I didn't draw anything. Mrs. Jules did not understand. It would have taken me the whole period just to draw one picture, said Calvin, and Bibi would only have been able to draw 100 pictures. But with the two of us working together, she was able to draw 378 pictures. That's a lot more art. Bibi and Calvin shook hands. No, said Mrs. Jules, that isn't how you measure art. It isn't about how many pictures you have, but how good the pictures are. Why, a person could spend his whole life just drawing one picture of a cat. In that time, I'm sure Bibi could draw 1,000,000 cats. 2,000,000, said Bibi. Mrs. Jules continued, but if that one picture is better than each of Bibi's 2,000,000, then that person has produced more art than Bibi. Bibi looked as if she was going to cry. She picked up all the pictures from Calvin's desk and threw them in the garbage. Then she ran from the room. I thought her pictures were good, said Calvin. He reached into the garbage pail and took out a crumpled up picture of an airplane. Bibi walked outside to the playground. Louis, the yard teacher, spotted her. Where are you going? He asked. I'm going home to draw a picture of a cat, said Bibi. Will you bring it to school and show it to me tomorrow? Louis asked. Tomorrow, laughed Bibi. By tomorrow, I'll doubt if I'll be finished with even one whisker. What do you guys think? How do you measure art? Is it how many pieces of art you can produce or how good the pieces are? It's really funny to think about it, and it makes you think maybe not to rush. It also makes you wonder how much art you could produce in a short amount of time. Chapter 7 is Calvin. Remember, Calvin was Bibi's assistant. Calvin had a big, round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Mrs. Zarves for me. Miss Zarves, said Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarves, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Said Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it over to her before I lose my patience. But, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Ha, 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 laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways, but he also forgot to build a 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist, who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hey, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarves? Said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarves? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always the best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, but Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Miss Zarves on the 19th story? Asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Miss Jules. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin. But it was nothing, really. I love that chapter about Miss Zarves on the 19th story and how she doesn't exist and how he doesn't deliver the note to her. It's really funny playing with things that are opposite or things that don't exist. When you're reading, it makes it super humorous. So I hope you guys are finding this book as funny as I do. And we are finished up with chapter 7. Next, we're going to learn about Myron. All right, guys. Talk to you later. I miss you. Bye.